Veteran detective uncovers dark secret in police department, but when she learns the true identity of the killer. Detective Sarah Collins leaned back in her creaky office chair, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct seemed to buzz louder than usual, matching the persistent throbbing in her temples. At 52, she was no stranger to long nights, but this case was different. He'd gnawed at her, refusing to let go. Her partner, Detective Mike Ramirez, 48, paced the small office they shared, his footsteps creating a steady rhythm on the worn linoleum floor. "Something's not right, Sarah," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "We're missing something." Sarah nodded, her silver-streaked hair catching the light as she turned to face the large corkboard dominating one wall of their office. Pinned to it were dozens of photos, reports, and sticky notes. The sum total of their investigation into what the press had dubbed Evergreen Murders. For the past 6 months, the peaceful town of Millbrook had been rocked by a series of brutal killings. 5 victims, all seemingly unconnected, found in various locations around the Evergreen State Park. Each body bore the same distinctive markings, intricate patterns carved into the skin post-mortem. The media was having a field day, and the pressure from City Hall was mounting with each passing day. "Run it by me again, Mike," Sarah said, her voice rough from too much coffee and too little sleep. "Maybe we'll catch something we missed." Mike sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. Victim number 1, Jessica Lynn, 32. Jogger, found by the lake. Victim 2, Robert Hawkins, 45. Park ranger discovered near the old fire tower. Victim 3, Melissa Carter, 28. Camper, body found at her campsite. Victim 4, Daniel Weiss, 39. Hiker, located off one of the main trails. And Victim 5, Emily Foster, 22. College student found near the park entrance. Sarah closed her eyes, picturing each crime scene in her mind. "We're sure there's no connection between them?" Mike shook his head. "None that we've found. Different ages, occupations, backgrounds. The only thing linking them is the park and those damn carvings." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Officer Jenny Wu, a rookie barely out of the academy, poked her head in. "Detectives, sorry to disturb you, but there's been another one." Sarah felt her heart sink. "Where?" "Evergreen State Park, ma'am. Near the old abandoned ranger station." Sarah looked up at him, her face pale. "I know him. It's Detective Frank Holloway. He was my first partner when I made detective." The revelation hung in the air, heavy with implications. Sarah's mind raced. What was Frank doing here? And how was he connected to the other victims? As if reading her thoughts, Mike voiced the question they were both thinking. "Sarah, you don't think? Could this be related to an old case?" Before she could answer, Officer Wu approached them, her young face etched with worry. "Detectives, we found something else. You might want to see this." She led them a short distance away from the body, to a large oak tree. There, carved into the bark with what appeared to be a knife, was a message. "The sins of the past will be paid for in blood." Sarah felt her blood run cold. Pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a picture she didn't want to see. She turned to Mike, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go back to the station. Now." As they hurried back to their car, Sarah's mind was in turmoil. The carvings, Frank's presence, the ominous message, it all pointed to something she had hoped was long buried. A case from early in her career, one that had haunted her for years. The drive back to the precinct was a blur. Sarah barely noticed the scenery flashing by, her thoughts consumed by memories she had tried so hard to forget. Mike, sensing her distress, remained silent, occasionally casting worried glances her way. Back at the station, Sarah headed straight for the records room. Mike closed on her heels. "Sarah, what's going on? Talk to me," he pleaded, as she began rifling through old case files. Sarah paused, her hand resting on a dusty box labeled, "Old Cases, 1999. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Mike, I think I know what's connecting these murders. And if I'm right, God help us, we've made a terrible mistake." She pulled out a thick file, its pages yellowed with age. The label on the front read, "Millbrook Massacre, 1999. Mike's eyes widened in recognition. The Millbrook Massacre? But that case was solved. We caught the guy. Sarah shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's just it, Mike. I don't think we did. And now, someone's making us pay for our mistake." Mike cursed under his breath. "We'll be right there." "Thanks, Jenny." As the young officer left, Sarah and Mike exchanged a grim look. 6 victims now. Pressure was about to increase tenfold. The drive to the crime scene was tense, the silence broken only by the occasional crackle of the police radio. As they neared the park, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. It was there, just out of reach, a word on the tip of her tongue. Crime scene was a flurry of activity when they arrived. Uniformed officers had already cordoned off the area with yellow tape, and the forensics team was setting up their equipment. Sarah and Mike ducked under the tape, flashing their badges to the officers standing guard. Dr. Amelia Patel, county medical examiner, was already bent over the body. She looked up as the detectives approached, her dark eyes somber behind her glasses. "Detectives, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "What have we got, Doc?" Mike asked, voice low. Dr. Patel stood, snapping off her latex gloves. "Male, early 50s. Cause of death appears to be strangulation, but I'll know more after the autopsy. And, well, you can see for yourselves." She stepped aside, allowing Sarah and Mike a clear view of the victim. He was lying face up, his unseeing eyes staring at the canopy of trees above. But it was his chest and arms that drew their attention. Carved into the pale flesh were the same intricate patterns they had seen 5 times before. "Damn it," Mike muttered, turning away from the sight. Sarah knelt beside the body, her eyes narrowing as she examined the carvings more closely. Something about them nagged at her memory, but she couldn't quite place it. "Doc, these markings, they seem familiar somehow." Dr. Patel nodded. "I've been doing some research. They remind me of certain tribal patterns, but I can't pinpoint the exact origin. I've sent photos to an anthropologist friend of mine. Hopefully she can shed some light on it." As Sarah stood, a glint of something metallic caught her eye. Partially hidden beneath the victim's collar was a thin silver chain. "Hold on," she said, reaching for a pair of gloves. Carefully, she pulled the chain free, revealing a small pendant. Mike leaned in for a closer look. "Is that a police badge?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Not just any badge. This is a retired detective's shield." She turned the pendant over, reading the engraved name and number. "Oh no. What is it?" Mike asked, concern etching his features. As she opened the file, a photo slipped out, landing face up on the floor. It showed a younger Sarah, standing next to Frank Holloway and several other officers. They were smiling, celebrating the closure of a big case. But now, looking at it with the knowledge of what had happened to Frank, that smile seemed more like a grimace. Sarah picked up the photo, hand trembling slightly. "It all started here, Mike. 25 years ago, and I have a feeling it's far from over." The weight of her words hung heavy in the musty air of the records room. As Mike looked at his partner, he saw not just the seasoned detective he had worked with for years, but a woman carrying a burden she had kept hidden for far too long. "Tell me everything," he said softly. Sarah nodded, clutching the old case file to her chest. "Let's go to our office. This is going to take a while." As they left the records room, neither detective noticed the figure watching them from the shadows at the end of the hallway. A figure with cold, calculating eyes and a heart full of long-nurtured vengeance. The game was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than Sarah or Mike could possibly imagine. Sarah and Mike settled into their office, the old case file spread out on the desk between them. Clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time, as Sarah gathered her thoughts. Outside, the sky had darkened, and a light rain began to patter against the windows, as if nature itself was setting the mood for the grim tale about to unfold. "The Millbrook Massacre," Sarah began, her voice low and somber. "It was the case that made my career, and now I think it might be the one to end it." Mike leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "I remember hearing about it when I was still in uniform. 5 victims, right? All found in their homes?" Sarah nodded, pulling out a series of crime scene photos. 5 victims, 5 families torn apart. It was the summer of 1999, and Millbrook was a different place back then. Smaller, more tight-knit. The kind of town where everyone knew their neighbors, where people left their doors unlocked at night. She laid out the photos one by one. Each showed a suburban home, pristine from the outside, but the interior images told a different story. Rooms in disarray, blood-stained walls, and chalk outlines where bodies had been. The Taylors were the first, Sarah continued, pointing to one of the photos. John and Mary Taylor, both 45, and their teenage daughter Emily, found on a Sunday morning when they didn't show up for church. The scene was brutal. Multiple stab wounds, signs of a struggle. But here's the thing. There was no forced entry. Whoever did this, the Taylors had let them in. Mike studied the photos, his brow furrowed. And the other two victims? Sarah pulled out another set of images. Samuel Chen, 52, a local shopkeeper, found 2 days later in his store's back office. Same MO, multiple stab wounds, no forced entry. And finally, Laura Hoffman, 38, a kindergarten teacher. She was found in her home the day after Chen. 5 victims in less than a week, Mike mused. The town must have been in a panic. Sarah's eyes took on a faraway look, remembering those frantic days. You have no idea. People were terrified. Nobody knew who might be next. Mayor was breathing down our necks. The media was having a field day. And there I was, barely 2 years into my detective badge, working the biggest case of my career. Paused, taking a sip of her now cold coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. Frank Holloway was lead detective. He took me under his wing, taught me everything I know. We worked around the clock, following every lead, interviewing every person who so much as jaywalked in Millbrook that week. Mike leaned back in his chair, processing the information. So what broke the case? Sarah pulled out another document from the file. Police report dated August 15, 1999. We got lucky. Or at least, we thought we did at the time. Patrol officer responded to a disturbance call at a local bar. There was a guy there, drunk, ranting about how he'd cleansed the town of its sinners, said he'd done God's work. The killer? Mike asked, his eyebrows raised. Sarah nodded. That's what we thought. His name was Jacob Reeves, 28 years old. Local oddball, had a history of minor offenses, public intoxication, trespassing, that sort of thing. When we brought him in for questioning, he confessed to everything, gave us details only the killer could have known. Sounds pretty open and shut, commented. Sarah's face darkened. That's exactly what we thought. We were so relieved to have caught the guy, be able to tell the town they were safe again. Jacob Reeves was arrested, tried, and convicted. He's been in Millbrook Correctional Facility ever since. Mike frowned, sensing there was more to the story. But now you're thinking he wasn't the real killer? Sarah sighed heavily, running a hand through her hair. I don't know, Mike. For years, I never doubted it. But now, with these new murders, carvings, Frank's death, I can't shake the feeling that we missed something back then. Something big. She pulled out another document from the file, a psychiatric evaluation of Jacob Reeves. This report always bothered me, even back then. The psychiatrist noted that while Reeves confessed to the crimes, he showed signs of being highly suggestible. There was a line in here that's been haunting me for years. Patient exhibits a tendency to incorporate suggested scenarios into his own narrative, potentially creating false memories. Mike's eyes widened as he grasped the implication. You think he might have given a false confession? Sarah nodded grimly. Possible. We were so focused on closing the case, on giving the town closure, that we might have pushed too hard during the interrogation. Fed him details that he then regurgitated back to us. Heavy silence fell over the office as the weight of this possibility sank in. Jacob Reeves was innocent. It meant the real killer had been free all this time. And now it seemed they were back. Mike broke the silence, his voice hesitant. Sarah, these new murders, you think they're connected to the Millbrook massacre? Sarah stood up, walking over to the corkboard where the details of the recent killings were displayed. Look at the victims, Mike. Jessica Lynn, the jogger. Her parents owned the convenience store next to Samuel Chen's shop back in '99. Robert Hawkins, park ranger. He was a rookie cop during the original investigation. Melissa Carter, the camper. Her mother was Laura Hoffman's teaching assistant. Mike's eyes widened as he began to see the connection. And the others? Sarah pointed to the remaining victims' photos. Daniel Weiss, the hiker. He was a crime reporter for the Millbrook Gazette in '99, wrote extensively about the case. Emily Foster, the college student, named after Emily Taylor, the teenager killed with her parents. And now Frank. Your old partner, Mike finished, pieces falling into place. Sarah nodded, her face grim. Everyone connected to the original case in one way or another. And those carvings, I knew they looked familiar. She pulled out an old evidence photo from the Millbrook massacre file. They were at the original crime scenes too, but we dismissed them as random damage during the struggles. We never made the connection. Mike stood up, joining Sarah at the board. So we're dealing with what? A copycat? Or the original killer? Sarah finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone who knows details of the case that were never made public. Someone with a grudge against everyone involved in the investigation and conviction of Jacob Reeves. A chill ran down Mike's spine as he considered the implications. If that's true, then you could be a target too, Sarah. Sarah's face was a mask of determination and guilt. I know, but more than that, it means we put an innocent man in prison for 25 years. We ruined Jacob Reeves' life, Mike. And now, more people are dying because of our mistake. Mike placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. We'll make this right, Sarah. We'll find the real killer and clear Reeves' name. Sarah nodded, grateful for her partner's support. We need to start by talking to Jacob Reeves. If he's innocent, he might have information that could help us. And we need to warn potential target. Anyone else connected to the original case. As they began to formulate a plan, Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Dr. Patel, the medical examiner. Sarah's face paled as she read it. What is it? Mike asked, concern etching his features. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with shock. The anthropologist friend Dr. Patel consulted about the carvings. She says they're not tribal patterns at all. They're pages from an ancient text, Book of Retribution. Mike frowned. What the hell is the Book of Retribution? Sarah shook her head, voice grim. I don't know, but I have a feeling we're about to find out. And I don't think we're going to like what we learn. As if in response to her words, a loud clap of thunder shook the building, and the lights flickered ominously. Sarah and Mike exchanged worried glances, both feeling as though they were standing on the precipice of something dark and dangerous. Little did they know, their investigation was about to take them down a path that would not only challenge everything they believed about the Millbrook massacre, but also force them to confront long-buried secret that would shake the very foundations of their careers and their lives. As the storm raged outside, Sarah and Mike prepared to dive deeper into the mystery. Unaware that every step they took was being watched by eyes filled with a quarter-century of pent-up rage and a thirst for vengeance that would not be easily quenched. The game was indeed just beginning, and the stakes were higher than they could possibly imagine. The next morning dawned gray and gloomy, a fitting backdrop for Sarah and Mike's drive to Millbrook Correctional Facility. The prison loomed before them, a concrete monolith surrounded by razor wire and guard towers. As they passed through security, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the lion's den. You okay? Mike asked as they were led down a long corridor by a stone-faced guard. Sarah nodded, though her clenched jaw betrayed her tension. I've been avoiding this place for 25 years, Mike. Avoiding him. They were shown into a small, stark interview room. Table, 3 chairs, and a large mirror that Sarah knew was a one-way window. The air felt thick with anticipation. The door on the opposite side opened, and Jacob Reeves shuffled in, his hands and feet shackled. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The man before her bore little resemblance to the wild-eyed youth she remembered from 1999. This Jacob was gaunt, skin pale from lack of sunlight, his once dark hair now streaked with gray. But his eyes were clear and sharp, fixing on Sarah with an intensity that made her want to look away. Detective Collins, Jacob said, his voice surprisingly soft. I always wondered if you'd come. Sarah swallowed hard, gesturing for Jacob to sit. Mr. Reeves, this is my partner, Detective Ramirez. We're here to ask you some questions about the Millbrook massacre. A bitter smile played at the corners of Jacob's mouth. After 25 years, let me guess, something's happened out there, hasn't it? Something that's made you doubt. Mike leaned forward, his voice calm and professional. Mr. Reeves, there have been a series of murders in Millbrook. Murders that bear some similarities to the 1999 case. Jacob's eyebrows rose. Similarities? You mean someone's copying my work? The sarcasm in his voice was palpable. Sarah met his gaze, her voice steady. That's what we're here to find out. Jacob, I need you to tell me the truth. Did you really kill those people in 1999? For a long moment, Jacob was silent, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Then, slowly, he shook his head. No, Detective Collins. I did not kill those people. I never did. The admission hung in the air, heavy with implications. Sarah felt a mix of relief and horror wash over her. Relief that her suspicions were confirmed, horror at the realization of what it meant. Then why did you confess? Mike asked, brow furrowed. Jacob leaned back in his chair, a sad smile on his face. Do you know what it's like to be interrogated for hours on end? To be told over and over that you're a monster, that you've done these terrible things? After a while, you start to believe it. Especially when they keep feeding you details, showing you photos. I was drunk, confused, and scared. And you? He looked at Sarah. You were so convinced it was me. I thought if someone like you believed it, then maybe I really had done it and just forgotten somehow. Sarah felt a wave of guilt wash over her. Jacob, I'm so sorry. He waved off her apology. Save it, Detective. Sorry doesn't give me back 25 years of my life. Mike cleared his throat. Mr. Reeves, can you tell us anything about the real killer? Anything you might have seen or heard back then? Jacob was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. I've had a lot of time to think about those days, that there was something. A man I saw hanging around the neighborhood a few times that week. Tall, always wearing a hat pulled low. I remember thinking he looked out of place. Sarah leaned forward, her heart racing. Did you tell us about this man during the investigation? Jacob nodded. I tried to, but you were all so focused on me, you didn't want to hear it. Said I was trying to shift blame. Sarah and Mike exchanged a look. This was new information, potentially crucial to their investigation. Jacob, Sarah said softly, we have reason to believe that the killer might be targeting people connected to the original case. Is there anyone you can think of who might hold a grudge? Someone who might want revenge for your wrongful conviction? Jacob's eyes widened slightly. My sister Abigail. She never believed I was guilty. Spent years trying to prove my innocence. But I haven't heard from her in, God, must be 5 years now. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. We'll look into it, Jacob. Thank you for your help. As they stood to leave, Jacob called out, Detective Collins? Sarah turned back to him. Find them. The real killer. Make this right. Sarah nodded solemnly. I will, Jacob. I promise. As they left the prison, Sarah and Mike were silent, both lost in thought. It wasn't until they were back in the car that Mike spoke. So what now? Sarah started the engine, her face set with determination. Now we find Abigail Reeves, and we dig deeper into the Book of Retribution. Something tells me they're connected. Their next stop was the Millbrook Public Library. The head librarian, Mrs. Eleanor Phelps, was a small, bird-like woman with sharp eyes behind thick glasses. When Sarah mentioned the Book of Retribution, Mrs. Phelps' eyes widened. Oh my, she said, her voice hushed. I haven't heard that name in years. Follow me. She led them to a locked room in the back of the library. Inside were shelves of old leather-bound books. Mrs. Phelps pulled out a slim volume, its cover so faded the title was barely legible. The Book of Retribution, she explained, is an obscure text, supposedly written by a 17th century cult. It details rituals for exacting revenge on one's enemies. Nasty stuff, really. But what's interesting is this. She flipped to a page near the back. There, in faded ink, were drawings that looked eerily similar to the carvings found on the victims' bodies. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. Mrs. Phelps, has anyone checked out this book recently? The librarian shook her head. No, dear, this copy never leaves this room, but she hesitated. But what? Mike pressed. Well, about 6 months ago, a young woman came in asking about it. She spent hours in here taking notes, said she was doing research for a true crime podcast. Sarah and Mike exchanged a look. This woman, Sarah asked, did she give a name? Mrs. Phelps nodded. Yes, I remember because it was unusual. She said her name was Abigail Reeves. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Jacob's sister had been researching the very book connected to the current murders just months before they began. As they left the library, Sarah's phone rang. It was Dr. Patel. Detective Collins, the medical examiner's voice was tense. I've found something you need to see. Can you come to the morgue right away? Sarah agreed. her sense of foreboding growing. At the morgue, Dr. Patel led them to a body covered by a sheet. "I was re-examining Frank Holloway's body," she explained, "and I found something I missed initially." She pulled back the sheet, revealing Frank's left arm. There, almost hidden in the intricate carvings, was a series of numbers. "Coordinates," Mike said, leaning in for a closer look. Sarah pulled out her phone, quickly entering the numbers into a map app. Her face paled as the result came up. "It's an address, 1242 Sycamore Street." Mike frowned. "Why does that sound familiar?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "'Cause it's my address, Mike. Killer knows where I live." As if on cue, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. With trembling hands, she opened it. The message contained just 4 words. "The reckoning is coming." Sarah and Mike rushed out of the morgue, their minds racing. The killer wasn't just targeting those connected to the case. They were taunting the detectives, always one step ahead. As they sped toward Sarah's house, neither of them noticed the dark sedan that pulled out behind them, following at a discreet distance. In the driver's seat, a figure in a low-pulled hat watched the detective's car, old, calculating eyes. The game was entering its final deadly phase, and the stakes had never been higher. Sarah's house on Sycamore Street stood silent and still as the detectives pulled up, their sirens off to avoid alerting any potential intruders. The neatly trimmed lawn and cheerful flower beds seemed to mock the tension that hung in the air. "Stay behind me," Mike said, as they approached the front door, his hand on his holstered weapon. Sarah nodded, her own hand hovering near her gun. She fumbled with her keys, her usual steady hands betraying her nerves. As the door swung open, they were met with darkness and silence. They moved through the house methodically, clearing each room with practiced efficiency. Everything seemed untouched, exactly as Sarah had left it that morning. And yet, something felt off. It wasn't until they reached Sarah's home office that they found it. On her desk, placed with deliberate care, was a small, leather-bound book. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized it. Copy of the Book of Retribution. How did this get here? Mike wondered aloud, voice tight with concern. Sarah shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know, but whoever put it here has been in my house. They've been watching us, Mike, all this time." As Mike called for a forensics team, Sarah gingerly opened the book. A slip of paper fell out, a handwritten note in elegant script. "Detective Collins, your sins demand payment. Innocent have suffered long enough. When the moon is full, justice will be served." A.R. Mike read over her shoulder. "Abigail Reeves?" Sarah nodded grimly. "It has to be. But why? Why now, after all these years?" Before Mike could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Jenny Wu, the young officer from the precinct. "Detective Collins," Jenny's voice was breathless with excitement. "We've got a lead on Abigail Reeves. A neighbor reported suspicious activity at her last known address, 1517 Maple Drive." Sarah thanked her and ended the call, quickly relaying the information to Mike. "It could be a trap," he cautioned. "I know," Sarah agreed, "but it's the best lead we've got. We need to move fast." They left Sarah's house under the watchful eyes of the forensics team and sped towards Maple Drive. The street was quiet, lined with modest homes and overgrown yards. 1517 stood out, its lawn neatly mowed, curtains drawn tight against prying eyes. As they approached the front door, a crash from inside the house caught their attention. Without hesitation, they drew their weapons and burst in. The living room was a mess of overturned furniture and scattered papers. A back door stood open, swinging in the breeze. "MDPD, stop," Mike shouted as he caught a glimpse of a figure fleeing into the backyard. He took off in pursuit, with Sarah close behind. The chase led them through several backyards and into a dense patch of woods behind the neighborhood. The figure ahead of them was fast, darting between trees with the surety of someone who knew the terrain well. Suddenly, Sarah's foot caught on an exposed root, sending her tumbling to the ground. Pain shot through her ankle as she tried to stand. "Mike?" she called out. But her partner was already too far ahead, still in hot pursuit of their suspect. As Sarah struggled to her feet, leaning against a tree for support, a twig snapped behind her. She whirled around, gun raised, to find herself face to face with a woman she recognized from old photos, Abigail Reeves. Abigail's face was a mask of cold determination, her eyes burning with a fervor that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Detective Collins," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "I've been waiting a long time for this moment." Sarah kept her gun trained on Abigail, even as she felt her injured ankle threatening to give way. "Abigail, please. We know Jacob is innocent. We're trying to make things right." A bitter laugh escaped Abigail's lips. "Make things right? You took 25 years of my brother's life. You took our parents. They died believing their son was a monster. How can you possibly make that right?" "By finding the real killer," Sarah pleaded. "Abigail, these new murders? Are you involved?" Abigail's expression flickered, a mix of emotions crossing her face too quickly for Sarah to read. "I'm not the one you should be asking that question, detective." Before Sarah could respond, a gunshot rang out, echoing through the woods. Both women flinched, their heads turning towards the sound. "Mike," Sarah breathed, heart racing. She turned back to Abigail, but the other woman was already melting into the shadows of the forest. "This isn't over, Detective Collins." Abigail's voice floated back to her. "The reckoning is coming. For all of you." Ignoring the pain in her ankle, Sarah stumbled in the direction of the gunshot. She found Mike in a small clearing, breathing heavily, his gun still raised. On the ground before him lay a man Sarah didn't recognize, clutching his shoulder where blood seeped through his fingers. "He came out of nowhere," Mike explained, his voice shaky. "Tried to ambush me. Sarah, he had this." He held up a wicked-looking knife, blade etched with familiar patterns. Sarah felt her blood run cold. The carving knife. As they waited for backup and paramedics to arrive, Sarah filled Mike in on her encounter with Abigail. The injured man on the ground remained stubbornly silent, refusing to answer any questions. Back at the precinct, the mood was tense. The man Mike had shot was in surgery, his identity still unknown. Abigail Reeves had vanished without a trace, and the threat of more violence hung over them all like a storm about to break. Sarah sat at her desk, poring over the files from Abigail's house. Most were related to Jacob's case: court transcripts, news clippings, appeals documents. But one file caught her eye. It was labeled simply X. Inside, she found photos of all the recent victims, including Frank. But there were other photos too, older ones showing people Sarah recognized from the original Millbrook Massacre investigation. Each photo was marked with a red X, except for 3. Sarah's own photo, Mike's, and one of a man Sarah hadn't thought about in years: Judge William Hawthorne, who had presided over Jacob's trial. "Mike," she called out, her voice urgent. "I think I know who the next targets are." As Mike hurried over, Sarah's phone buzzed with a news alert. Her heart sank as she read the headline: "Retired Judge Found Dead in Home. Millbrook Killer Strikes Again." The race against time had just become even more desperate. As Sarah and Mike rushed to brief their captain, organize protection for themselves and their families, neither noticed the janitor quietly mopping the hallway outside their office. Hat pulled low over his eyes, listening intently to every word. The killer was closer than they could have imagined, and the final act of this deadly drama was about to begin. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity and mounting tension. Judge Hawthorne's murder had sent shockwaves through Millbrook, and the pressure on Sarah and Mike to solve the case had reached a fever pitch. They had been working around the clock, fueled by coffee and the gnawing fear that they might be next. The man Mike had shot in the woods had survived surgery but remained uncooperative. His fingerprints weren't in any database, and he refused to give his name. They had taken to calling him John Doe. It was nearing midnight when Sarah, rubbing her tired eyes, noticed something odd in the crime scene photos from Judge Hawthorne's house. "Mike," she called, her voice hoarse from fatigue. "Look at this." Mike leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the image. "What am I looking at?" Sarah pointed to a small object partially hidden behind a bookshelf in the judge's study. "Does that look familiar to you?" Mike's eyes widened as he recognized it. A police badge, identical to the one found on Frank Holloway's body. "It can't be a coincidence," Sarah muttered, her mind racing. "But how? Wait." She quickly pulled up the personnel files of everyone involved in the original Millbrook Massacre case. As she scrolled through, a pattern began to emerge. "Mike, look at this. Frank Holloway, Judge Hawthorne, even the victims from '99, they all had connections to the police department. John Taylor was a retired cop. Samuel Chen provided catering for police events. Laura Hoffman volunteered at the Police Athletic League. Mike frowned, following her train of thought. You think our killer is a cop? Before Sarah could respond, a commotion outside their office caught their attention. Officer Jenny Wu burst in, her face pale. Detectives, John Doe, he's escaped. The next few minutes were chaos as the precinct went into lockdown. As alarms blared and officers scrambled, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something wasn't right. Mike, she said, her voice low and urgent, we need to get to the evidence lock. Now. They made their way through the panicked corridors, Sarah's instincts screaming that they were missing something crucial. The evidence locker was deserted, the officer on duty presumably responding to the escape alert. Sarah quickly located the box containing evidence from the recent murders. Her hands trembled as she opened it, dreading what she might find, or rather what she might not find. It's gone, she breathed, her worst fears confirmed. The carving knife we recovered. It's not here. Mike's face drained of color as the implications sank in. Someone on the inside. But who? A slow clap from the doorway made them both whirl around, guns drawn. There, leaning casually against the frame, was Captain David Russo, their commanding officer for the past 5 years. Well done, detectives, Russo said, his voice chillingly calm. I always knew you'd figure it out eventually. I just hoped it wouldn't be quite so soon. Sarah's mind reeled as pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. Russo had been a junior officer during the original Millbrook Massacre investigation. He'd had access to all the case files, all the evidence. He would have known every detail of the crimes. Why, Captain? Mike asked, his gun still trained on Russo. Why kill all those people? Russo's face darkened. Because justice needed to be served. We took an oath to protect and serve. But what happened in '99? We served up an innocent man to appease a terrified public. We betrayed everything that badge stands for. So you decided to become judge, jury, and executioner? Sarah spat, disgust evident in her voice. Russo shrugged. Someone had to pay for our sins. I started with the original victims' families. They pushed hardest for a quick conviction, didn't care who went down for it. Then those who were directly involved in railroading Jacob Reeves. And Frank? Judge Hawthorne? Mike pressed. Loose ends, Russo said coldly. They were starting to remember details, asking questions. Couldn't risk them putting it all together. Sarah's mind was racing. Abigail Reeves? Was she working with you? Flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossed Russo's face. Abigail was a means to an end. I fed her information, used her research. She wanted to clear her brother's name, and I wanted to cleanse the department of its rot. By becoming a murderer yourself? Sarah couldn't keep the anger from her voice. Russo's eyes hardened. I did what needed to be done, and now, detectives, I'm afraid our little chat has to come to an end. It happened in a flash. Russo reached for his weapon, but Mike was faster. 2 shots rang out, and Russo crumpled to the ground, his gun clattering away unfired. The aftermath was a whirlwind of internal affairs investigations, press conferences, and long nights of questioning. Sarah and Mike found themselves hailed as heroes by some, viewed with suspicion by others. The revelation that the killer had been one of their own shook the Millbrook Police Department to its core. Jacob Reeves was released from prison, his conviction overturned. The image of him walking out of Millbrook Correctional, blinking in the sunlight he hadn't freely seen in 25 years, would stay with Sarah for the rest of her life. Abigail Reeves was eventually found and arrested for her role in the murders, though her cooperation in the final stages of the investigation led to a reduced sentence. As for Sarah and Mike, the case had changed them profoundly. Trust they'd placed in the system, in their colleagues, had been shattered. But their partnership, forged in the fire of this investigation, emerged stronger than ever. 6 months after Russo's death, Sarah stood before a class of new police academy recruits. Her hair had more gray now, and new lines etched her face, but her eyes burned with the same determination they always had. The badge you'll wear, she told them, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, is a symbol of trust. The public's trust in you and your trust in each other. But trust without vigilance, without a commitment to true justice, can lead us down dark paths. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the eager young faces before her. Your duty is not just to uphold the law, to constantly question it and yourselves. Remember the lessons of Millbrook. Remember that true justice demands more than just closing cases, demands truth, no matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient. As she finished her speech, Sarah caught Mike's eye at the back of the room. He gave her a small nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. They had been through hell together, had seen the worst that their profession could offer, but they had also seen the best in each other and in those who fought for real justice. The Millbrook massacre and its tragic aftermath would always be a part of them, a weight they would carry. But it was also a reminder of why they had become cops in the first place. Protect the innocent, to seek the truth, and to never stop fighting for what was right. As Sarah left the academy that day, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in months. Road ahead would be challenging, the scars of the past still fresh. But with each new officer they trained, each case they solved with integrity, they were rebuilding something precious. Trust between the police and the people they served. The sun was setting as Sarah drove home, casting long shadows across Millbrook. The town had changed, as had she. But as she watched the familiar streets pass by, Sarah knew that change, painful as it might be, was necessary. It was the only way to ensure that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. Case was closed, but its lessons would echo for generations to come. And Sarah Collins, despite everything, was ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring.